we are. And what I want to do is to, did you all get the timeline yesterday? Yeah. Okay, because I've updated it since, and I want to send you. Here we are. The latest one. There is actually a mistake on it, which somebody spotted. I got the. I just took a citation from somewhere that was. But other than that, I think I haven't altered that on this version because I've only just found out about it. But we are going to have a bit of a tour de force. And this is the amended one. I've sort of put it on the screen here. And I thought what would be really, really useful was to do a bit of a sort of overview of the different styles and schools of iconography, because people get some very confused ideas about what icons are, what makes an icon, what doesn't. And I think one of the things that happened in the 20th century was the dominance of what I call Paris school. People like Ouspensky, Losky, great theologians and thinkers and artists for that matter. But they had a particular take on iconography based on their Russian roots. And a lot of their focus is on the Novgorod and the Moscow school, also the Puskov, but basically those two schools. And in the West, the renewal of interest in iconography has been so grounded in their work that a lot of the sort of models that people turn to tend to come from that basis, to the point that people have a very narrow view of what an icon actually is. Now, Marie's just said, can you tell us where the error is? Nancy, can you tell us where that error is? Because you're the one who picked that out. So second sheet on the, if you see on my screen, see it says Santa Maria di Ginestare in Catalonia, Spain. That's wrong. Nancy, you're muted.
Your image is very unclear.
Well, do you have the timeline yourself?
Yes.
Go straight down from St. Francis, the heading at the top, and it's right below the Winchester Bible. There's a little vertical Pantocrator mural.
Yes.
And it says it's from Santa Maria
de Ginestare. Yes.
From San Clement de Taul, and I can put it in the comments. I'm also emailing it to Ian.
Okay, so thank you.
It's, yeah. It's just we vacation in Taul, so I know it very well.
Wow, excellent. Well, so I thought, right, well, I'll pick up some of the big sort of trends and just sort of do a bit of a sort of hop around. But then I decided that actually, let me do a timeline, a visual timeline of some of the schools of iconography that have been going on in the church. And actually, it's really surprised me. Let me, so if I'm talking and you're looking at the same time. And, over the years, you see so many different icons. And it says, oh, it's Greece and it's 13th century or 10th century somewhere or 15th century. And it all becomes a bit of a blur. And I certainly make all sorts of assumptions that, well, this icon must sort of belong with that lot over there or whatever. But actually putting them out on this sheet reveals something actually rather different. The first sheet, which you can see here at the top there, covers the first 1,000 years of Christian history. That's the patristic period. That's the period of the councils. That's the period when the church hammered out its theology, and is when the church was undivided. Well, I say undivided. It was not divided between Orthodoxy and Catholicism. It was divided between the Catholic Church, in the biggest sense of that word, and the monophysites, for example, the Copts, the Nestorians up in Syria. So it wasn't the undivided pure church for the first 1,000 years. It's always had schisms and breakaways. But it was a period when the Christian world was far more united than it was in the second 1,000 years. So this first 1,000 years, if you look at these images on the sheet, they're remarkably consistent with this Paleo-Roman style. So by that I mean, if you look at this little painting from the catacombs, you can see that while Jesus has an imperial sort of robe, the apostles are dressed as senators in those white robes with the clavus, dressed as Romans would be dressed, and indeed Jesus is too. Here, St. Mary Maggiore, those mosaics over the apse, you can see Jesus and the angels, those heavenly beings, all dressed in these white senatorial garments. Go 100 years later, the apse of St. Cosmas and Damian, same get out, same situation. The Rabbula Gospels from Syria, same sort of setup. And for example, Jesus appearing on the cross, again, you look at the Apostle John. It's a very consistent style for 700 years. And that style then begins to be augmented by other cultural elements. So, for example, if we look at the Coptic icons, you can see they're a different style, different pose, different posture, but also these the sort of garments that they're wearing, the way they've retained the clavus, for example, on the bishop's vestment, but the whole way that it's done has a decidedly non-Roman feel to it. And even though you say, look at Jesus there, holding that book's almost identical to the book of the Sinai Christ, which is from Palestine, the Palestine area of influence, though some would say Constantinople, but I think that's wrong. And if you look at the little pilgrim box there and the icons on that, again from the time of Justinian or just after it, still this very, very consistent style. Then we get the period of iconoclasm. And with that, you've got the destruction of images in Constantinople and throughout the Eastern Empire. It wasn't just a little blip in Constantinople for a couple of years. This was a systematic period of destruction across the Byzantine world. However, and this is what began to really fascinate me, was you realize actually there's nothing from Constantinople left apart from perhaps, see this little fragment, the Cotton Genesis from the 4th, 5th century, which they think was Constantinople, but it's a guess. And even that's reflective of the same common star that we've just identified. Nothing from Constantinople at all. So during this early period, Rome features a lot. In fact, it's dominant from the catacombs through to the magisterial compositions in churches and even icon panels. So you've got the Uronica, the Mandylion, effectively, which is at the top of Santa Scala. We've got Madonna della Clemenza di Santa Maria in Trastevere, and various other very early icon panels of the Virgin Mary. Rome, which is sort of poo-pooed within Orthodox circles, it's almost like, oh, nothing good can come from Rome, and if it is, it's only because it was a sort of copy of what the Greeks were doing, or the Greeks in Rome were doing it. But actually, there's no evidence that it was a sort of situation of an imported art and that the locals were just sort of knocking out rubbish. The monuments of Rome, I mean, for example, the Abbot's Mosaic of St. Cosma and Damian, you know, you look at that, that is a superb piece of work. That's not just some sort of local blip. Rome, and then you say, look at Ravenna. Okay, this is all part of the Byzantine Empire, but these are places quite able to stand on their own 2 feet in terms of producing works of exceptional quality. The other thing that we have to bear in mind is that scholars made a sort of assumption that in the early Byzantine period, there was only really one big city at work, and that was Constantinople. And anything of any quality, therefore, had to come from Constantinople. And it's sort of catch-22 argument, really. You say, oh, well, it must be from Constantinople because it's a really great work. But why Constantinople? Because it's the only place that can produce a really good piece of work. Whereas, as Byzantine historians have revised their understanding of the early period, which wasn't really studied very well, there were actually a number of competitors to Constantinople. Alexandria, Antioch, and Rome still remained a major cosmopolitan city of immense wealth and development. And it was only later, after iconoclasm, that Byzantium became this place of mythological proportions and dominated the whole cultural scene for 200-300 years. So we're dealing before the period when Constantinople reaches that zenith, and when Rome and Alexandria, Jerusalem, Antioch were still major players in the Orthodox Catholic Christian world before the Islamic conquests in the 7th century onwards. So you have this very rich, dynamic world, but with a very consistent language of art. Even, I mean, fascinating. You see the earliest bit of wall painting from Dura Europa, the house church in Syria, which is before 257. You see the virgins carrying their candles. That's almost identical to the procession of virgins in San Vitale in Ravenna, Sant'Apollinare in Ravenna. So here you've got something on the far fringes of the Byzantine world, or Roman world, very early on, and a consistency of style. Then, interestingly, okay, so Rome goes through a really hard time. Byzantium goes all iconoclastic. And in the West, you have the rise of Charlemagne and the Carolingian dynasties. And local communities, like in Ireland, England, and Scotland, developing their own very rich artistic traditions. So, for example, at the same time as you've got those Coptic icons, you've got the Book of Kells, and you've got the crucifixion fresco in Rome. You've also got the Lichfield angel, which, while maybe not executed with finesse, is nevertheless a pretty impressive bit of iconographic work. So outside of the big imperial centers, you begin to get work of exceptional quality and beauty, but not drawing so readily from the Byzantine Roman fountain. And they're introducing new elements. And I suppose the most obvious example of that is the Book of Kells, or earlier on, the Book of Darrow, both of which are bringing in Nordic, Norse elements. And there seems to have been quite a close connection between Egyptian Christians and Irish Christians during this period. So you've got all sorts of cross currents going on. And once iconoclasm is sort of eclipsing the East, the center of creativity becomes the Carolingian Empire, and the community, the Christian communities on the fringe of the Byzantine world, like, as I say, the Irish, British. I know a little bit about that. That's why I put that in, because that's just actually personally just interesting. But look at that ivory. I mean, from an iconographic point of view, that is a superb piece of workmanship and of iconography. You can see the Annunciation, the baptism, very interesting one there of Jesus falling asleep in the boat. This isn't copying Byzantine models as though they don't know what to do. This is a lively, vibrant, creative, and liturgically sensitive and aware bit of work. And if that wasn't impressive enough, look at that. This is in rock crystal. I mean, it is a superb, delicate piece of work. This is craftsmanship of the highest order. And what I think is really lovely, notice how they've arranged the angels as though radiant from the hand of the Father. And the Holy Spirit is on the same arc. The movement of the angel at the bottom and of John the Baptist leads you up to the center, and Jesus stands in the water, humbly accepting everything, entering into the waters of death. It's absolutely superb. As an icon, it's really, really works. And then you look at this. This is an example of a whole style of illumination, which gets taken up into other forms in the next sort of 100, 200, 300 years. Look at the way those garments are done. It's so filled with a sort of shimmering energy, as though the whole figure is filled with the Holy Spirit, and it's sort of radiating with this rippling energy of creativity. It's inspiration, sort of in the very folds of the cloth. It's a fascinating and incredibly inventive, totally non-Byzantine and non-Paleo-Christian technique. But at the same time, they're able to produce something like this, which was for a long time presumed to have been Roman and early, but actually is a Carolingian copy or version. So then we get the triumph of orthodoxy. And the angel there is from the moment when the Byzantine world renounced its heresy and embraced iconography for a final time, and actually incorporated the Sunday of Orthodoxy as a celebration of the icons. The rest of Christendom had not committed this heresy. The Roman world and the Western world had remained faithful to the vision of Christian art that had come through without a break. Only in Byzantium was there this massive break with the tradition. Now that break, I think, had an interesting impact, because then you get that angel, and by any mark of imagination, that's a monumentally impressive piece of work. The poise, the dignity, the glory of those wings, for example. Very different from the angels that have been portrayed up until this point, where they're very much sort of attendants. They are, for example, in here, or likewise in here, that same pose. The angels are in the background. They're doing their bit. They're like guards on duty. Even here, noble and wonderful as they are, they're still angels doing their job. They're there for a purpose. But in this image, the angel is on a different league. And you could actually say that the understanding of the angelic realm is changing with this, because the angel himself is the center of awe, rather than turning up around the place to help the main characters get on with their job, be that the Virgin Mary or Jesus or the apostles. So big shift. And I think what begins to happen is that after the repression of creativity, the Byzantine world sort of goes overboard, and having gone through this purgation where it's really had to think through the theology of iconography and the place of art in the liturgy, it sort of comes with a sort of renewed vigor, which comes right from the top. So from the patriarch downwards, you've got this sort of absolute commitment to creating art of the liturgy, which is really worthy and informed and shaped in a very official way. And that figure there, like, see those figures there? There they are, dressed as Byzantine court princes, soldiers in sort of formal dress. But look at the difference between that, where there's a sort of meekness and a humility, to this. This is magisterial. This is your high command who's just flown in and demanding complete submission and obedience. I mean, you wouldn't want to cross him on a bad day. And this sense of the sort of magisterial really, I think, is a hallmark of Byzantine iconography in the ongoing period. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But just because Byzantium is back in the game doesn't mean that all these other places of no value. And one of the things that I've tried to do in the continuing timeline is to counteract the often unspoken message that the only reliable source for iconography is that which is associated with orthodoxy in the East, and that the West really is at best a sort of copying outpost of Byzantium, but certainly when it tries and does anything itself, it must be decadent or poor. I don't agree with that, and I think I can show you why. First of all, as I say, if we go back to the period when Byzantium was sort of lost the plot, you can see that the works that were being produced by the Ottonians were of superb quality. And indeed, even what was going on in Britain and places like that was of exceptional quality, even if it wasn't coming from that Paleo-Christian tradition, but from pagan art. But I don't think anybody would argue that the Book of Kells is anything but a work of sheer brilliance and of theological nuance. So, for example, one of the reasons you can't see most of the details on these pages, and that's because it was only to be seen by God, which is fascinating. You know, it was a real theological work of prayer. This wasn't for an individual man to go and look at and gaze at. This was something which was a prayer in paint, an offering really on the altar. Anyway, to get back to our story. So here we have the Macedonian dynasty, and followed that by the Comnenian period. Now, this is a time of renewed energy, creativity, wealth, and it's when Constantinople is at its zenith as the greatest city on earth, really. And the art of Constantinople reflects that confidence. So, for example, everything from that little triptych in ivory. But look at the Hosios Lucas images, or the Palatine Chapel, or the dome in Daphne. Suddenly the imagery and the Virgin in Orange in Kiev, or St. Mark's Venice, all being done by Byzantine artists. And it's monumental stuff. These are very solid figures. You look at the icon of the Virgin there in Kiev. I mean, she is a solid woman. That's not a sort of flight of fancy. This is a solid physicality that you're dealing with. And in all those figures, the communion of the apostles, there's a very definitely inhabiting a space, and those bodies have a monumentality to it. Compared to the elegance and delicate work of the Registrum Gregori there, or that crucifix, which is from Cologne, part of the Ottonian culture. I mean, that is expressive, delicate, sensitive, and has none of that sort of heavy, imposing gravitas of the work, the Byzantine work of that time. And even in the panel icons, you see I mean, I love them. You know, this is not to disparage any of this. I mean, it's all wonderful stuff, but they all are very different. And say that icon of St. Nicholas, the frown, the seriousness, he is definitely a sort of weighty presence. And the same with the Ustig, if I pronounce that right, Annunciation. These are very, very solid figures inhabiting the space. And the way in which the Virgin Mary is that big silhouette against the sort of background, This is an art of confidence and strength and power. So the Church of Constantinople, the work that was being done was of a very proud city that knew its greatness, and that's reflected in the confidence of its artists, the materials that they're using, the scale at which they're building. And that was impressive, and yes, everybody else tried to copy it. So, for example, the Normans in the Kingdom of Sicily built this, but they didn't do it because they didn't, we're just poor little, people from the backwoods who are Catholics and don't really know what they're doing. They did it because it was the very best that was available. And they didn't divide, I don't think, themselves up into Byzantine, Orthodox, and sort of Western Catholics. That wasn't that mentality at that point. It was Christendom, and it was the Christian world, and you went for it. Now, part of the reason I think that becomes really clear is because while Byzantium and the nobility, the wealthy, the mighty were producing stuff like this, go a little bit further out and you find something really radical going on. Look at those figures on the crucifixion there from Macedonia, Neretzi. I mean, they are transformed. Their proportions are very elegant and elongated. The folds are very animated. The body's contorted and deeply expressive. On a totally different register than that. And yet, they're produced at the same time. And you can tell that one is a place of wealth and power because of the amount of gold on the walls. The other place is a more humble situation, and they've executed the work accordingly. But that agitation or animation is exactly what you find there in the Winchester Bible. Now, in certain circles, the iconography of Neretzi is held up as a sublime example of Byzantine iconography. And the Winchester Bible, well, it's after the separation, it's a bit dubious, it's Catholic, Western. It does have some redeeming characters, but it's almost a begrudging thing. But it's just, I think, ridiculous. If you actually compare those two styles, they are both reacting against, in some way, the monumentality that you find in the imperial art of the era. And I think that's a spiritual thing. Now, another thing which is to be put into that, one is that the crossover between East and West only seems remarkable to us because we have such a clear idea of the division between Orthodoxy and Catholicism. And so everything is being passed down, especially by the Orthodox, into Orthodox and non-Orthodox, Eastern and Western. But the evidence suggests that this is something that really only takes root gradually, and really after the rejection of the Council of, I think, where was it? When they all met at Florence, Council of Florence, and they had the reunion between East and West, and then it all fell apart because the Orthodox back in Constantinople wouldn't swallow it. But for example, you look at the mid-12th century Torcello in Venice. Now that is full-on Constantinopolitan Byzantine schema, far closer to what was going on in Kiev than what was going on in Macedonia, far closer. And yet that is Catholic Venice. If that doesn't convince you, there's a little mosaic I put in there, which is from the Basilica of the Nativity And I've had the privilege of being able to go right up close to these mosaics when they were being restored, and got the inside story on these. And what's fascinating is it's obviously a Byzantine style. All the inscriptions are in Latin, and it was paid for by the Latin king of Jerusalem and the Byzantine emperor. They paid for it together. And what makes it even more interesting is the man who designed it and executed it was actually an Assyrian Christian from Iraq, who was a miniaturist. Fascinating that he decorated the whole church in this style. So the fluidity of that period of art in the Christian world has been, I think, written out of the script because it doesn't fit with contemporary issues and with the prejudices, really, of the art historical world of the 19th century, which saw everything medieval as primitive and backward. Constantinople as a sort of, Byzantine, if you say something's Byzantine, it's sort of like dubious and double dealing and all that sort of, a very negative view. And then the sort of dialogue between Orthodoxy and the West very much sort of gets caught up in all of that, which is more to do with the fall of Constantinople and that sense of lack of confidence, I think, in the Orthodox during the centuries of persecution. But when you actually look, you can see that not only was there sort of the imperial style, but for example, look at the frescoes from Studenica in Serbia, the way that cross is being done. The arms, the very, very different, the elegance of that, than the sort of heavy Byzantine style, which was more the norm at that time, is certainly in Byzantium and imperial circles. In the mannerism of this very famous Annunciation, which I think we all know of, the way in which those garments are all sort of frilly and thrown about is much more similar to the work of Matthew Paris, which you know I have to think about, and the wider Romanesque style, which you find, for example, in the Royal Portal over Notre Dame in Paris, which is really sort of breaking away from that sort of Byzantine style and exploring things with a sort of vivacity and an energy, seeing stone being brought to life, very much being at home with the matter of stone, which you carve into statues at a time when in Byzantium they'd moved away from any sort of carving, except bas relief, as seeing as sort of dubious. But again, if you look at, say, the cross there from Pisa, and I think the Italian school of crucifixion is sublime. It's fully in tune with the core of the tradition all the way through, but introduces elements of delicacy and sensitivity, as has Studenica. The sense that somehow it's a Western thing to introduce this idea of Jesus suffering on the cross or the passion of Jesus is clearly not true. It's a movement within Christianity, but it's not so separate as some maybe want us to believe. And likewise, innovation. Look at the Serbian example there of women at the tomb with the angel. I mean, that's radically different in its simplicity, in its sense of aliveness, vitality, its humanity, compared to, say, that work that we saw earlier on of the sort of big monumental style. but also, you've got, say, the Chilander monastery with that quite severe ascetic Christ. Compared to that, the angel and the women, look how they've got so much feeling and emotion. That you're being invited into a conversation there. You're in that meeting point. And then at the same time, if you look at the Docio nativity, that's very clearly within the central iconographic tradition of how you show the nativity. Okay, you've got a certain naturalism, or they would see it as classicism. It's going back to the classical models. They've been doing that in Byzantium for centuries, constantly going back to their Hellenistic roots. And you find that in the poses and so forth of so many icons. So it's not such a radical step as people might now think, because they want to compare it to things like the St. Matthew Ocrid or the work of Manuel Panselemos and the Cretan school, or Our Lady of the Don, or the St. Michael, we can see there, of Athens, or the Ocrid Annunciation. All of those, we all immediately think, oh, these are icons, because they're in all the books and in Orthodox churches and used. But, for example, the Cimbui of Our Lady enthroned, oh, is that an icon? Oh, it's a bit Italian. It can't be because it's not an Orthodox church. But actually, if you compare that image of Our Lady with, for example, Our Lady of Vladimir, or you go right back in the tradition, this one here, or in the Rabbilah Gospels, or in this early example, this is completely at home in that tradition. The posture, the presentation, the attendant angels, there's a very odd sort of perspective going on. It's far more calm and tranquil. It's not cluttered. The Ocrid Annunciation is on another planet. You look at that furniture. I mean, it's packed full of stuff in a way which is completely at odds with, say, the work of Theophanes the Greek. Look at the famous Transfiguration, how really simplified everything is, from the posture of the figures to the mountains to the colouring, the silhouettes of around the Virgin, and these very empty backgrounds. The Virgin there, the Cimabue, is more elaborate, it's true, than the, say, Theophanes the Greek and so forth there, but it's far more calm and orderly and consistent with the tradition than what they did in Ocrid and what they started doing with these buildings. So while in or for example, let me show, that's what, you see the Virgin enthroned there. Quite a radical development there. See the depth of the throne. You see its monumentality. There is something far lighter and heavenly, really, I think, in the Cimbui, and therefore it's much more rooted in the tradition than the innovations that are coming in here in the Cretan school. But because in Orthodoxy, the Cretan school has been so dominant, this is sort of the resonance, but this is the ideal that we think the tradition is holding up to us. But actually, I don't think it is. It's one element, and it's a wonderful element. But the icon tradition is so much richer. So, for example, if you want to really see, look at that. Dionysius' crucifixion. Look at the emptiness, the rhythmicism. the simplicity, the mutedness. In fact, those Russian icons of that period actually are in complete contradiction to what's going on in the Greek world. It's a totally different spirituality. And you can see, say, for example, you claim that Moscow icon of the Virgin Mary. Look at the throne, how simple and minimalistic it is compared to the Virgin enthroned from Crete. And what you have there in Catholic Italy, this quintessentially Catholic image, stands right between the two. So to suggest that these are somehow dubious or derivative or second best or sort of icons, it's rubbish. They're as much icons as that or that. The only difference is that those don't appear in Orthodox churches and monasteries, and they do appear in Catholic churches. And that's also important, because I think the idea that Catholic churches don't have icons has only been true since the Renaissance, when we swept away all of the richness of Western iconography and replaced it with the humanism of the Renaissance and then the Baroque, which is a totally different ballgame. But if you look at the coronation of the Virgin there by Fra Angelico, or the Wilton diptych, you have got images making present the realities of heaven. These are images painted full of the wisdom of the church's tradition, but breaking through and using new elements, new perspectives. So, for example, yes, they have got their backs to us in Fra Angelico's work, but it's not done in such a way to make us excluded and looking through a window. It's actually to include us in the crowd. The principle is the same. And the use of gold is very clearly about light and the importance of light as part of the beatific vision. And the use of color is about radiancy. You are looking at a sacred, you know it's a sacred image, and it moves you with awe and wonder. You might want to argue the Wilton diptych is a bit sort of, well, it doesn't look like a Byzantine Virgin Mary because the headdress is a bit angular rather than that domed look. That's true. She doesn't have the stars and she doesn't have the edging on her garment. But actually, nor does that one. So it's a bit difficult to say, well, just because of that, you're not dealing with an icon. And actually, if you look at the style of those figures and how elongated they are to introduce the idea of elegance, that's exactly what you're getting there with this Novgorod icon. But this is a much more simple, much more folk art type of art, rather than these images which are designed to look imperial. They're designed to look like a queen on her throne, and they are to be looked at by people who live at that level. One of the reasons these works survive is precisely because they were commissioned by people who would be able to protect them and put them in the best places. And then, say for example, if we look at Giotto's work there, look at how he's doing the ground. It's infused with radiant light. That is not a natural landscape. It's got a certain depth, but it's not a natural landscape. This is a transfigured world, but with figures which are more recognizably human than, for example, the St. Matthew in Ochrid. But when you look at all the different figures as they are in icons, for example, the way they are there, you are dealing with deliberate attempts to make things look human. They're supposed to be recognizably human. So, I mean, this has been a bit of a tour de force, and it's difficult really to know quite how to break all this material open so that it becomes accessible. But I think probably what I'd suggest now, break into groups, 2 groups, for 5 minutes or so, and have a conversation about what you've heard and any elements that have come up in your mind and thinking, and then bring them back to me. Now, I'm not saying I'm right. I'm just sharing with you my observations and what I've seen laying things out. Now, for sure, I think there is a much broader dynamic to the church's iconographic tradition than most Orthodox will allow us to have. Doing this exercise convinced me in a way that I didn't think I would be. So I've actually shifted my opinion quite radically in the last 48 hours just by laying it out and comparing things on a time scale. So I'm just saying I'm in the process of reevaluating a lot of this stuff, and your observations and thoughts and reactions as people in the iconographic world will be valuable. So I'm now going to put you into your little groups, and we'll call you back in sort of 5 minutes or so. Let me put you in 2 groups, and then that should be good. Right, off you go, everybody. Time to talk on the news. I hear they're all coming back now. There we are. There, everybody. So, any comments, observations, reflections, arguments, disgustedness? What's the how's the discussion been?
We need a lecture on what isn't iconography.
Yes.
Because we
Yes.
talked about some of the very modern icons, like kind of some of the ones from Eastern Europe, and they're quite very kind of modern, very abstract. They're still kind of, where's the borderline of what their iconography is? Are they still icons?
Yeah.
Ian, didn't you do a podcast a while back talking a bit about this?
Yes. Yeah, there is something in conversation. I think we talked about that.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there are certain key elements. The first thing is art for the liturgy. So that's really, really important. It's art for the liturgy. Secondly, it's rooted in the tradition of church liturgical art. It's not about reinventing the wheel. And I think the key is, if you think of anything to do with the liturgy, like a hymn, for example, music, melodies. Some music is obviously secular music that people choose to play in church. But if you want something that really transcends and brings heaven to earth, then you need something that is of that genre. And I think that in the Catholic Church, you can see what happens when people forget that, and it becomes, I've got to be careful what I say, but basically entertainment and keeping people engaged. And you get a lot of this when people are teaching children or doing children's masses. So you've got to make it so the children will enjoy it, as though they're not going to enjoy heaven. This is the ridiculous thing. Oh, well, it's got to be sort of, I don't know, Lion King-esque or something for a child to be able to really grasp something awe-inspiring. In the West, I think we have a real problem because of our attitude towards liturgy has become very humanistic. and human focused. So we gather, we are a body, we are a community, we share bread. The language has become very, very predominantly humanistic. Iconography is the art of the transfigured world on earth. And so that's why just making a religious painting doesn't make it an icon. In the same way that just because you're singing about Jesus doesn't mean to say it's heavenly music. There's a place for everything, but the liturgy has its own particular inner logic and dynamic, and I think that is what we do with the icon. Taking that to the next step, people ask about canonicity. And again, that's not an easy thing to sort of pin down, because actually, I was saying about this morning, that the Orthodox have become really, really strong on having canonicity in iconography. And they'll say with great gusto, oh, this icon is not canonical. But when you actually dig into Orthodoxy and their canons, which do exist abundantly, they don't keep them themselves. So, for example, the key doctrine of the Christian faith is the Holy Trinity. And the icon of the Holy Trinity, according to a really big council in Moscow in the 16th century, should only be that now modeled by Andrei Rublev's Trinity. And you cannot, should not, must not have an old man representing God the Father. You should not have a human representation. Well, for sure, there are all sorts of Russian churches, and let alone Greek Orthodox churches, full of these images. So even something like that, if that's kept more in the breach than in the actuality, I think that's a good indication that actually when people talk about canonicity, it's not just a question of finding a council somewhere that ruled something in or something out. It's much more about being in a river of continuity. And that's where I think tradition really makes the big difference. Just because somebody has a council and says you can stand on your head doesn't mean that therefore becomes received by the church. And I think you see that in terms of the way in which icons become received by the community. People will feel comfortable with some images and not with others. Some are more controversial, stylistically or thematically. But there is a sense, when I say tradition, I mean the tradition as not human traditions, but the core of the Christian faith, which is the creed, the scriptures, the apostolic ordering of the church under the patriarchs, everything that sort of has made Christianity for 2,000 years. So it's the essentials. And iconography is the art of that tradition. So the things to sort of really, it's not about, oh, well, they've always done it, but it's about saying, is it scriptural? Does it reflect the church's teaching on the divinity of Christ? Does it serve to articulate the faith of the church, or is it somebody just using it to express their own faith and religion? And there's a classic example of this on Facebook only today. Mary Jane Miller, who must be my bête noire, I think. What she does to iconography, it's the only time I've actually nearly physically thrown up looking at artwork. And she did an iconostasis for peace, which included the Baals on the, she did an iconostasis, but instead of like saints and Jesus and all of this, it was Muhammad, Buddha, Jesus, all as the same. And then above that, there were the Baals and the Ashtaroths and goodness knows what else. It was diabolic, in my opinion. Well, she's now just put on Facebook, she's dressed up these women as priests in those Orthodox vestments with the big crosses and all this sort of stuff to make, she uses it to make theological points. It's ideological. So it's a good example where ideology is using a style rather than a style which serves the church. Lentz is another guy who does this, though I think his icons are really rather beautiful and he does really beautiful work. But when he makes like Martin Luther King, you could stretch things, at least as a Christian. But when it's, say, Rumi or non-Christians, then, well, what do you mean that these are saints? That's not the church's understanding. And this is where the liturgy, are these images of the liturgy? No, because the liturgy only commemorates in its prayers canonized saints. And there's a formal process for that. It's not just the guys I like, it's not my personal hero. So an icon is rooted in the liturgy as it is, not as I would like it to be. The icon articulates the prayers of the church. It's very conservative in that way. It's really about the church as it is, not about pushing the boundaries and saying, oh, well, I think women should be priests, or saying that, we should recognize all these people as holy people. So when we say the tradition, we're talking about that sort of wodge of stuff that's right in the core of Christian identity. And there's basically been there all the way through, explored in lots of different ways and all the rest of it, but it's the core stuff. So iconography, to be iconography, is rooted in that. Now, when it comes to style, and I think, somebody mentioned about these Eastern European icons, and I know some of the ones you mean, and I'm of the opinion that actually those are probably legitimate icons, it's trying to express the saints, the teaching of the church in an idiom which is clearly resonating with that Byzantine iconographic style designed for the liturgy. They're not introducing heterodoxy under a guise of a style. They're trying to develop a style which makes the faith fresh. And I think that's legitimate. And I think there's one particular guy, and he does, all his faces are done in sort of oranges, and it's all quite abstract, but it's very tender and it's very radiant. Talk about radiancy and stuff. And, if you look on that timeline that I showed you, and how, the stuff that was going on in the Balkans, like in Serbia at one point, they really broke the boundaries of style to enhance the presentation of the content. And I think that's the order. The content is what is important, not the style serves the content. So there's a feeling about business, about liturgical art. You feel it. There's just a presence, and it's a divine presence that's working through this art in a consistent way. So it's not what we are doing, it's what God is doing in us and through us and with us, for us, and roots us into that tradition. You sort of feel it. I don't know, is this making sense?
Yes.
Sort of, Nancy?
Well,
I have a question, but it's, was that you, Myrna, following up? Someone was following up. Mine is a little bit different. It's like an anecdote.
I said,
Yeah.
yes, it does make sense. Yes, up to a certain
Thank you.
point.
Up to a certain point. It's all a bit sort of difficult to pin down, which is why in certain circles there is such rigidity and an attempt to control iconography with a sort of iron fist. And any of you who've been on some of those sort of hyperdox forums where, it's like, this is orthodox. I mean, it's unbelievable, the ferocity with which people speak about this. And I think that's precisely because it is so nebulous, actually, that can be quite intimidating because it's such a precious content that you don't want to lose. So therefore, people frame the debate in terms of defending something that's very precious. And that then becomes a bit aggressive. Whereas I think if people are more at home in that tradition of the church, and it's about how you articulate it, you can be more gentle and more explorative. But Nancy, you had an anecdote.
Yeah, I heard this a while ago, and maybe you were aware of it since it's something that happened in London. So I heard that the British Museum at some point came into possession of a Virgin Enthroned.
Okay.
Right at that 1300 era, just right at that point where things were about to start to really change into Renaissance thinking. But they were trying to decide if it was an icon or a painting. And they just went back and forth, and it was like, right, it's an icon, and it got shipped off to the Victoria and Albert instead of being hung in the Sainsbury wing.
No.
I don't know if it's true or not, but I heard that, and to me, it's just always been emblematic. Whenever I get to that period of Italian art, especially at the 12 and 1300s, it's like, I think it's perfectly legitimate as an icon subject for iconography, but I just think that's really funny. They had all those scholars, coming from that art history background, saying, "Is this an icon? If it's an icon, it's a craft. It's not art." I mean,
Unbelievable.
Now it's the bottom line is that they don't view icons as a worthy art.
Yeah, exactly. And this is a hangover from the sort of presumption of the Enlightenment that they are enlightened. Yeah. And the medieval era, why was it called Gothic? Because it was the Goths. It was a pagan, debased art form. Byzantium was some backward-looking, obscure, mercurial sort of thing. The whole of Western art history, historians and what's been done, is full of all sorts. I mean, I hate this phrase, colonialist sort of viewpoint. But actually, when it comes to art, it's certainly very Western imperial centric, and with a very sort of presumption of superiority of one art over another, and one era over another, and one political system over another, and philosophy and ideology. So this has framed how people look at it. And also, I mean, you think about it, there wasn't like a moment when they all said, right, we're all now going to be naturalists. We're going to play naturally. There was somebody somewhere who one day went, oh, I like this. I'll try that. I'm not happy with this. I want to break out of that. And then somebody else copies it and follows it and you begin to create a ripple and a movement. But there was no different than what they were doing, say, in the Balkans, when they took those bodies, say like that crucifixion, and Jesus's arms are stretched out like plasticine. I mean, there's no difference in doing that than, creating a bit of depth in your perspective. And the thing which I think really sort of puts the cat among the pigeons is if you go to the next era. I didn't cover this, but if you go to the 18th century, the 17th century, and the 16th century, Orthodox icons increasingly embrace and include all sorts of naturalistic, sentimental elements. And now the purists will say, these are debased. This is not pure Orthodox iconography. But it's still in the churches and it's still being made. And then you look at some modern Russian cathedrals and stuff, the people love them. And there has to be a sense, I think, where we have to say iconography also has to be received. It's like the church has a principle that theology, dogma has to be received. Even like the Immaculate Conception, had to be received by the bishops, had to be received by the church, and the Pope pressed to make the decree of the Immaculate Conception. Very, very strong fundamental principle of Orthodox theology, Christian theology. So iconography also is in the process of being received. People find Christ in these particular images, they pray with them, they want them, and they're in their churches. So, for example, Western iconography has to include statues. And there are very early Byzantine statues. There's one in the Victoria and Albert Museum, a beautiful carved piece. But it's really very much the Western church which has sort of been comfortable with that. But it's certainly been received in the church. That there's a way in which I think our theological principles, our artistic aesthetics, have to also sit humbly before how the people of God work with this work that we produce. And I used to be much more purist about this, but I think I've shifted in that, sentimental Virgin Marys who, with Mary looking sweet and baby Jesus looking like he's loved, has found a universal place in the church, East and West, despite all the efforts of the Orthodox purists to keep them out. And in the same way, the Catholic faithful respond to icons and golden images and all that sort of thing, despite the many attempts to try and sort of wean us off that sort of superstitious stuff and give us something, modern and contemporary and, that speaks and is all that. People still go back to certain things. And I think part of our work is to discern, how things are received, and we have to have a certain humility about that. So, for example, there are various schools of iconography, like the Ethiopian or the Coptic, which is much more of a folk art, or the Romanian stained glass stuff, again, much more folk art. A lot of Russian icons, incredibly simplistic, and particular styles in Russian icons where they're terribly detailed and theological and all the rest of it, which really take them off into another plane. It's not iconography as it was for the first 1600 years. And yet they found a place in the Russian Orthodox Church that really articulates the way in which they pray and how God is with them. So I think we can afford to be a little more relaxed, but more vigilant. So we're not just accepting, this is the ideology of iconography from certain quarters. And we have a freedom to appreciate that God is working through a whole range of media. But having said that, then to insist on high standards. So, for example, I am appalled at the rubbish that are being put into churches and cathedrals. in England. Ah, it's an icon. Oh, well, it looks odd, but icons look odd, so it must be a good icon. And it's made with prayer, and the guy can talk his hind legs off saying about what icons are and all the rest of it. But it's rubbish. It is rubbish. It's just painted badly. If it was my student presenting that work, I'd say, well, I think that thumb's the wrong length. And, well, you haven't got your folds right. And, well, that's a deformed body. And you're not transfiguring matter, you're plastering it. You know, the colours you've used are all, you know, they're not soul-filled. They are just garish. And there's all sorts of things you do as a teacher to say to people, this isn't good. Yes, Marie.
So I've had that Kikatissa, and I struggle so much because I don't see her folds in her garment working, in a way that I understand. And yet, it's partly because I'm trying for a Byzantine, icon. And so, there's certain ways that the Byzantines would represent those folds, but I'm almost at a point of where I just want to do it. I don't want to have it. So will it end up being an icon, or whether it's just my own thing?
Well, I think, Marie, what I would say is, I think you can see from today there is no such thing as the Byzantine icon. That's the first thing. There are a range of styles to be found within the Byzantine icon house. And they're very fluid and very flexible and very adaptable. So if you end up doing a Kikatissa, but it incorporates other styles, other elements, but you're not changing its theology, and you're not debasing its artistic integrity. It's got to look nice. You want something beautiful. Then,
but at the same time, like if I added all sorts of shadowing, and at some point it's going to be reflecting a different theology. If I don't use that element of simplification, which is actually a way of reflecting on God in a way, anyway, I do think, if I just went and just said, well, I can do it, and incorporate a lot of other things, I may be sending a different spiritual reflection too,
And I think, Marie, you're right. You're very right to be cautious and wary. And what I would say is, I think especially when we're learning,
yes,
we never stop learning, but when we really are learners rather than practitioners, we need to really immerse ourselves in the models, in examples. So don't start playing with them until you can copy them. And why do we copy it? Just simply so you can get on the inside and feel what's right.
Mm-hmm.
And this is why I tend to give you really classic models. I don't give you my work really to follow. I did with the St. George, it's true, but that was slightly different. But usually, like with the Kikatissa, like with the face for the Mandilion, and the Annunciation. So I'm taking classical, mainline, non-controversial classics of the tradition, and getting you to get on the inside of that, to get the feel of how that works. And once you've internalized it, then the creativity becomes natural, because you're articulating his voice, and you find something that tunes better. Why change something? Because it sounds better.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And that's to do with context. So, for example, when I was doing the Lichfield icons, which is when I really started finding out about Matthew Paris, was because I could have just copied the Ochrid Annunciation and just done it big, or just done it. But actually, when we were in the cathedral, it had the voice of God in its architecture, in its space, in its time, in its history.
Mhm.
And so I was listening to that and trying to tune my work to resonate with all of that. And that was everything from the color in the stained glass window to the monumentality of the architectural structure to the eras of church art and architecture that were already there. And that gave birth to a unique style, which, you know, I look at those icons and I'm a bit sort of not overwhelmed with awe and wonder, but they do the job. But the thing which made it all okay was going back 2 weeks after they were in and talking to one of the guides, and she said it's as though they've always been here. You know, they really embedded themselves. And I remember when they actually went up, I still remember it. The lights went on in the building. And like the Virgin Mary was suddenly monumentally present in the building. And I felt she's back after 500 years. She's back. She's not just a little tucked away little image. This is right in the heart of what this space is about. And the colors in the composition brought the colors of the stained glass windows into the building. And theologically, it was all about the Annunciation. So that puts you right up at the altar, at the Eucharist, at what the building was built to be for. And you can build, you weave it together. So I think the problem when you're just doing a little panel icon, you don't know where it's going, is, well, you haven't got much to resonate with. It's all just very big and grand and a bit impersonal, but you still have to do that. And if you're going to change something, make sure it really resonates. It really pins something into the faith of the church. And it's got to resonate with you. It's got to resonate with the liturgy, that where it might be used. It's a home. Okay, that's a slightly nuanced liturgy, but it's still where you pray. You still want an image that's going to be the right size, that's going to hold you. You want an image which is going to convey the joyful sadness that everybody needs when, you know, because you might go when you've just given birth to your first child, or you might go when you've had to bury your child. It, you know, the icon has to be there for all those moments. So you need to sort of bed the work into its liturgical niche. And if you're doing those things from within a sense of love for the church and for the church's liturgy, wherever it's happening, then it will probably be okay. It might not. You might miss, you know, you shoot your arrow, it might miss. A lot of icons are okay. Very few, I think, are brilliant. And that's part of the humility of the thing, I think, really, is, well, what would be a brilliant icon? Because it looks more realistic? No. Its line and form? Maybe. Its radiance? Its physiognomy? And there's so many questions. It's actually difficult to think what a perfect icon would be, because the icon actually shouldn't exist. It's actually work that writes itself out of the picture, because it's actually about meeting the one being represented. And the icon is that humble means by, it's always just an image, it's always just wood, it's always just matter that is opening a door to something immense. And it resonates with that presence, but doesn't pretend to be or compete with that presence. And part of the problem, I think, with you see this with a lot of contemporary Russian icons, you know, the gilding that everybody goes for, the polished surface, which is just perfect, the perfect little details on the sort of swirls and decoration. it in a way, it's making the icon too material, too much of an end in itself. But you don't get much of a critique about iconography, like, oh, well, it's more about stylistic things. But actually, there is something about the icon becoming an end in itself as an artist, wanting my name on it. Somehow, written by the hand of, oh, come on, we're not stupid. You just want to put your name on it. So why do you have to put by the name of the hand of it? Just put it on the back if that's so important. You want people to know that you've done that work. It doesn't need to be on the front because this is about Christ. It's not about you as an artist. But you see how there's all sorts of little things that get into iconography, which really maybe shouldn't be. But we don't say, because they've written that on the front, it's not an icon. But maybe we should. If you're saying, is it a good icon about it? These are the arguments and discussions that I think within iconography circles we should certainly be having, so that we paint in an informed way. Anyway, folks, it's now nearly 2 hours we've been going on at this. Heaven help us. I made some bread while you were having your natter, so I've been leaving it to rise, so I can now go and cook it. So I'm going to go and have my tea. It's been lovely to see you all again, and look forward to those of you in the tutor groups next week. Tutor group startup. Anybody want to be in a tutor group, then send me an email. We'll put you in one best we can, and look forward to seeing you in a month's time otherwise for the next lecture. Brilliant.
Great.
All right, everybody.
Thank you.
God bless. Bye for now.
Bye bye. Bye, everyone.